So when we think of monasticism, we think of solitude, rejecting the world, brown habit on, maybe a wooden cross. And that's not far from the truth, to be fair. It's pretty spot on. But we need a longer video, so let's go into more detail about it. I'll give you a quick background on where monasticism actually came from in general. So in the 3rd and 4th centuries, there were people called desert fathers, hermits in Roman-occupied Egypt, and they would leave society, renounce worldly goods, worldly pleasures, romantic sexual relationships, belongings, and they practice a form of asceticism, which is basically that, living off the bare minimum, things in like an extreme moderation. You're not going to eat for the taste, you eat just to survive. It's basically like hardcore monk mode activated type stuff. And yeah, eventually these monks kind of joined together, they joined forces, and they ended up living together in these little communities, where they would, the like-minded individuals live in the same way, living in solitude, constant prayer, and asceticism, renouncing earthly goods. But eventually the wider society started looking at these communities like as if they were the sort of bridge between heaven and earth, that they were these sort of mystical creatures. So Christians, and in particular wealthy Christians, they would donate large amounts of money, goods, to these monastic communities, in the hope that it will help with their salvation, cleanse their soul, things like that. So ironically, they ended up becoming very wealthy, very materially rich. And this is where I think the idea of a structured monastic society came into play. They would need an abbot, a leader, and senior monks to sort of guide the whole community through the process of handling all these materialistic items that they've got, handling their connections to the wider community, and obviously doing what they really should be doing, which is focusing on monastic life. So getting onto Britain, the first monasteries in Britain were in the 4th and 5th centuries, and this aforementioned ascetism is really what characterised these monasteries. So during this time, the migration period would have been sort of happening. The continental anglo-saxons, they would have been coming over at this time. So a lot of Romano-British people would have moved from the areas that were being taken over to the west, and this is where we see these monasteries taking place. And I think it's important to go into how much these Romano-British monasteries actually impacted Irish monasticism as well. So I can mention a couple of sites. Candida Casa is one of them, which means shiny white house in Latin, which is supposed to have been set up by St. Ninian, who Bede says was massively influential in evangelising and converting the Pictish people, the southern kingdoms of the Picts. And Candida Casa itself was located in Whithorn in Scotland. And this was a monastery that was known for educating Irish monks. And then we have a couple in Wales, like St. David's and Llancarfan. My pronunciation there will have been terrible, and I'm sorry. Which was led by Welsh saints, famous figures like Gildas, Caddoc, David. And these sites were massively influential to the Irish people because they'd come over, they'd spend significant amounts of time there learning, and they would go back to Ireland and not only just sort of take what they've learned, but literally establish networks of monasteries, of course heavily influenced by the things they've been learning. For example, St. Phineas of Clonard, who lived sort of late 5th to early 6th centuries, he studied at Llancarfan. I can't do that Welsh L. I'm trying for you, but I can't do it. And it's said that he actually spent 30 years at that monastery, and he lived quite a while, I think into his 70s, so he might have actually done that. But regardless, he did study there, and he went back to Ireland and established monasteries. So we have an example of a named individual doing that there. And as aforementioned, this ascetism, which was really, they were really strict on it. They were really sort of zealous about this ascetic lifestyle. This is a theme that really is present throughout all the monasteries that I've mentioned so far. Just a fun little bit of history. We do know that Gildas himself was concerned about monastic communities using animals to plough fields, because the argument was, if the poorest people don't have an animal to plough their fields, why do the monastic communities? So that's a little sort of taster, a visual of what asceticism can kind of look like and manifest like. So then getting on to Lindisfarne, which was established by Saint Aidan in 634 at the behest of Oswald of Northumbria, whose uncle was the first Northumbrian king to convert to Christianity. Saint Aidan, being an Irishman, will have inherited that ascetic monastic heritage that we've been talking about, and a century or so later has established Lindisfarne in England, and that has carried on, that has continued in Lindisfarne. So the Anglo-Saxons are now, sort of being Christianized in the north as well, a little bit later than the south of England. So let's talk about some Anglo-Saxon Christians. St Cuthbert being a big one, dying in the late 7th century. And the monks in Lindisfarne afterwards, they wrote things about St Cuthbert. They wrote documents about the way he was, the way he lived. And they talked about his amazing self-restraint and discipline, and the fact that he could go 3 nights in prayer without sleeping, and the fact that he was a hermit on an island near Lindisfarne for a while, and really didn't want to leave, despite it being for an election of him potentially becoming the new bishop, which eventually he did. But then in Bede's writings, Bede focuses way more heavily on Cuthbert's impact on the community around him. This idea of setting an example to the Anglo-Saxons, evangelizing, combating idolatry and any existing paganism that was still around at the time. So now we're getting onto the idea that some monastic communities did prioritize certain things over others. Obviously, ascetism was a big one for a long time, but it wasn't this single orthodox thing. There were different styles almost, and we'll get onto a bit more of that in a minute. But what's interesting about Bede's account of Cuthbert, and focusing less on the ascetism and more on his outreach, is that the twin monasteries that Bede grew up in and lived in his whole life, Wearmouth and Jarrow, they were very heavily focused on this outreach, this affecting the wider community, being a pillar of piety to the Anglo-Saxon people, and ultimately did have a massive influence on the monasteries in England. Bede's twin monasteries, well, they weren't his, they were Benedict's bishops, who was a nobleman. He was very rich, he loved Rome, he loved education, and he funded these twin monasteries, and actually sort of wrote his own rule for the way that these monks should live. Now, when you hear Benedict and rule, you may be thinking of the rule of Saint Benedict, and this is not that. Benedict's bishop is not Benedict of Nursia, but these set of rules for his community to live by was heavily influenced by the rule of Saint Benedict. I'm saying Benedict so many times, and you would imagine that there was other monastic communities out there that were influenced by the rule of Saint Benedict, influenced by other rules, influenced by their own heritage. So what I'm really trying to drive home here is that the monasteries throughout England, Britain at this time were not a single thing. You could go to one and go to another, and you'd get a slightly different experience, maybe a very different experience. And I think this is important to know, because when you're looking at early sources talking about monasteries, they are not always talking about what we think of when we think of monasteries. Not even like the monasteries that we've discussed so far in this video. I'm talking about places that will have been referred to as monasteries, where the communities that ministered there, like the priesthood, would have their wives and children living with them. These, sometimes were based around a cathedral, which we might not necessarily call a monastery now. So the term monastery is very flexible, it seems, at this time. A lot of modern historians will refer to the non-typical monastery folk as minsters. They'd call that organisation, that community, minsters. And it's I suppose it's helpful in differentiating from what we stereotypically think of when we think of a monastery. But our mate Bede, Venerable Bede, he did not like these minsters. He didn't like them at all. I'm gonna read a little excerpt of what he thinks about them. And this is a letter to Bishop Egbert of York. And he's talking about these kind of communities that I was just mentioning, where they would have women and children living with them and things like that. And I suppose they didn't practice asceticism or have these rigorous, full-on lifestyles of serving God, basically. So he says this: there are numerous places, as we are all well aware, described by the title monastery by a most foolish pen, but which have absolutely no trace of monastic life. The voice came to me like as I did it, so we're going to roll with it. And the rest of that is him just berating the whole idea of this minster setup. He was clearly not a fan of this kind of thing. He sees it as a false monastery. Now, getting on towards the end of the 8th century with the rise of the Viking invaders. Now, if you're a Viking, you see a monastery, it's a bunch of blokes who don't fight and have loads of gold around them. You're going to have pretty easy pickings. So in that regard, monasteries were in a lot of danger. They were also in danger, as an institution, because they were starting to be used for military purposes and advantages, and to tend to soldiers more than minister to a community or to serve God. And as you can imagine, with the rise of the Viking invasions over the next 100 years and more, it appears that monasticism in England throughout that time did take a massive dip. Even Asser, who wrote The Life of Alfred, so he's a contemporary with Alfred the Great at the end of the 9th century, he came over here and said, oh, the English don't seem to have much of a taste for monastic life, which at the time may well have been the case. It may well have looked like that, but as we've just been discussing, there were clearly some individuals throughout history who did care deeply about monasticism. What Asser was seeing was merely just a result of consequences, provisions, Vikings, raids, all that kind of stuff. But the tale is not over. There will be a rise of monasticism once again. In the mid-10th century, probably influenced by Europe, there's like a monastic reform. The rule of Saint Benedict is like really popular now. So we see this rule of Saint Benedict, Benedictine style monasteries coming into play in the mid-10th century. They were often backed by powerful people like King Edgar, Saint Athelwold, and perhaps because of their Benedictine relations with Europe, powerful secular people were happy to, stick a few quid in there and, get cozy with the people involved because it provided connections. And let's throw them a bone as well. Maybe they just wanted to be good, charitable Christians. And it's from this type of Benedictine monastery in the mid-10th century that so many of our surviving documents, so much history we are aware of, is thanks to these Benedictine reform monasteries from this time. So thank you guys. Thank you very much. I did actually make this video once before, but I was really nervous in front of camera. I didn't really stick to my script. It got more views than my Alfred video already, but I feel like I would rather put out something that I can say, that's alright, that, and not get as many views than put something out there where I'm like, I don't think that's going to be that helpful for people. So I'm going to stop yapping. Thank you for watching. Godspeed. If you won't mind subscribing, that'd be great, because I'm grateful to 32 subscribers. Is mad. I never thought I'd get 10, but I've got a taste for it now. Do you know what I mean? So stick around, because we're gonna have fun here. We'll have some fun.